Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks to everyone for being here. Give a few minutes for people to come in. Thank y'all for coming. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Becca to start us off today. But my name is Leah Whitehurst Gibson, and I'll facilitate some of the conversation a little bit later. For those who I haven't met, I think most of you have met at some point or another. Yeah, hopefully we'll have a really rich conversation today and spend some time thinking about and imagining and reimagining what we can do together to move conversations like this forward. So I'll turn it over to Becca to give us a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll get started. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Leah, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Becca Kendrick, and I do fundraising and development and communications for Virginia Community Voice. And just wanted to start by tying us back to the conversation we had last month that sort of is a precursor to this conversation. Some of you were with us and some of you were not, but what we talked about at the last conversation was around asking for what we need and more on a personal level, individual level, and why it's so hard to sometimes do that. Many of the things we talked about were just, very personal, like feeling like maybe we're not worthy of asking for what we need. Maybe we haven't taken the time because we don't perceive we have the time, maybe because of the systems that we live in, because of maybe just not having the tools to know how to tune in to our own selves and our own bodies and say, hey, what do I really need? And so we took some time to breathe. We took some time to tune in to what we need. And hopefully for those who were there, maybe you've been able to try some of that a little more. We talked about slowing down. I shared the story of my 3-year-old telling me I needed to slow down. And it actually happened again this week, y'all. I was moving so quickly to get into the car on Easter Sunday morning that I hit my head on the car. And my son just had to say again, Mama, slow down. You're moving too fast. You have to be more careful. And it just reminded me again of like how busy we get and all the ways in which busyness is also a function of the capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist culture, right? It all works to uphold those kinds of oppressive systems, that busyness, that moving so quickly. And so, again, the wisdom of babes, right? Like reminding us of how we need to slow down and tune in. And what is it that we really need in that moment? So we started talking about individuals at the last conversation. And now we're shifting to sort of thinking about more, how do we ask for what we need organizationally? Organizations are, after all, made up of individuals, right? Made up of people. And nowhere do we see that like tension really in asking for what we need in the nonprofit sector. Nowhere do we see that more around our conversations with funders and with the people who invest in our work. Asking for what we need is really very hard there for a lot of reasons. Again, maybe we don't feel like we're worthy. Maybe we have had, like Leah said, many negative experiences in the past of asking for what we need. It's particularly even harder. I acknowledge that someone with privileged identities, that it's even harder if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're, maybe not, don't have if you have a marginalized identity and you're asking for something from an institution that has typically been white-led, male-led. And so there's also these power dynamics at play. So I bring to this just a little bit of a personal experience, having both been on the side of being a grant writer and asking for what we need, and also being a grant maker, having had experience working for a philanthropic group that gave away funding. And it's interesting, I was trying to think about how would I describe like both of those positions. And as a funder, I feel like what I always would tell
what's going on with this
funded was, like, I'm here for you. My door is always open. Sorry, is someone having trouble hearing me? Should I pause?
I think Reverend Moore was having trouble. Bishop Moore, are you okay now? Can you hear us okay? Maybe not.
Okay. Other
Okay,
people can hear. Okay.
can everybody else hear okay? Yes, okay.
Okay.
I can
Yes,
hear
I
you,
can
but I
hear.
can't see you.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, for me to go ahead. So just from that funder's perspective, I feel like I was always saying to people, like, tell me what you need. I'm here for you. I want to be a thought partner. My door is always open. But in the same breath, I was often always saying or thinking like, but we only have limited resources. And also sort of is that what you really need? Or I want to make sure that what you're doing is effective because I need to be able to justify the funding. So that was kind of my funder perspective. And then on the other side, as a grant writer, it's often saying to funders, like, this is what we really need. But it feels like even if you're really nice to us, even if you're really friendly, even if you come to our events, that you're not always going to like show up for us when we really need it the most. Or we tell you what we need, but we only get a little bit of what we've asked for. Or we're offered things we don't really need. Like sometimes we're offered like boatloads of technical assistance when what we really need is like cash to pay our people. Yeah, just sort of that mismatch of like, it feels like our need to prove to you that what we're doing is effective is more important than like all the time we spend filling out all of these applications, right? All these burdensome applications and reporting forms and all of these kinds of things. So just wanted to say that like I get it for those of you who've been in similar boats, like it's there's a lot of reasons why there's sort of that mistrust between grant makers and grant receivers. And one of the reasons that many reasons why we wanted to have Rashawn come and talk to us today, and Leah's going to introduce her, but it's just because we actually haven't seen a funder do things the way that she does things, and the way that her foundation, the Weisberg Foundation, works is just really like, it's amazing. It's throwing us all because it's not the norms that we have seen, that there is more responsiveness, more trust. Like there is a feeling that she's really in our corner and is going to do all she can to help us get what we need. And that's just been really refreshing and amazing. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Leah to introduce Rashawn.
Thank you so much. And hey, everyone, for those that are just joining and for those that I haven't met, my name is Leah Whitehurst Gibson. I am the Executive Director for Virginia Community Voice. And so excited to have this conversation today, and so excited to be able to partner with Rashawn Atkins-Roan, who is here from the Weisberg Foundation. She is the Executive Director there. And I'll start this off honestly with just the truth about my interaction with Rashawn is almost every time I'm in the same space as Rashawn, whether it's virtually or physically, I'm always in tears because the reality is that I have been in this nonprofit space for a really long time, and I've even been in leadership spaces in this nonprofit space for a really long time. And this is the first time, the relationship that we have with the Weisberg Foundation, that I've really felt seen and heard and invested in. I remember very early, like maybe one of the first things that I said to Rashawn was like, no one outside of my close friends and family have ever invested in me the way that, and me and the work that we are doing at Virginia Community Voice, me personally and the work that we do, like Weisberg, and have been just really blown away because what Becca described a few minutes ago about asking for what we need more times than not from foundations and then not getting it, what it says to me oftentimes is you're just not worthy of it. Like, I'm going to ask you for what you need, you're going to tell me what you need, and then I'm not going to give you what you need. Makes me feel as someone who is out here doing this work that we're actually not worthy of that. And that has been the opposite experience for me and for the work at Virginia Community Voice when it comes to Weisberg. And so I thought it would be great to have Rashawn come and help us understand her mythology and the way that she thinks about things, or methodology, forgive me, and the way that she thinks about things, and the way that Weisberg and how she's progressed to this space, and then how Weisberg has progressed to this space, and how we can start to imagine a future where more funders are doing things the way Weisberg does them. And so so it's really going to be more conversational. I'm going to ask Rashawn a few questions, and then we'll open it up for dialogue and space. But you can always, this is like we've said in the past, this is a really informal space. We really want it to feel conversational. We want it to feel like everyone is involved in it. So just, if there's ever a time where you want to raise your hand and say, hey, tell me more about that thing, feel free to do it. We want this to feel like a space that is safe and that people can just ask what they need to ask. If there's ever a time where you're like, hey, can y'all stop recording so we can see this one thing? We're happy to do that as well. Just let us know. So yes, without further ado, Rashawn Atkins-Roane, if you want to say a few things and then we can jump into the conversation about kind of your perspective on some of these issues that we're talking about, and then we can jump into kind of a few questions.
Thanks so much, Leah and Becca. Thank you, everyone, for coming in today. I will say my heart is warm with the words you shared, Leah, but my mind is angry that the predominant experience that folks like you at Virginia Community Voice and other of our partners are doing on the ground are consistently not treated with the respect that you all deserve. And so it's angering for me to hear this. And I'm thinking about, how do we get you and other folks in front of funders to give this message, right? Because it's one folks need to hear. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rashawn Atkins-Roane. My pronouns are she and her. I'll just start by acknowledging the privileges that I have walking through the world as a cisgender, heterosexual woman who's college educated, who is not disabled yet, and who sits as a funder in this place. And I know that affords me power and position. The other thing I'll say is I tell people all the time, I'm both an accidental and a reluctant philanthropist. Accidental because growing up, I didn't know institutional philanthropy existed. This was not the job I said I always wanted to lead a private foundation. I knew of what we would call mutual aid today. So-and-so down the street lost their job, so we're picking up a few extra groceries. Thus and so's mom is in the hospital, so the children are going to spend the night with us for a couple days. And as a child of a Pentecostal mother and a Catholic father, that's a whole another webinar. I knew about the institution of tithing. And so that was really my experience with philanthropy. I'm a reluctant philanthropist because fundamentally, I believe philanthropy is complicit in so many of the issues that we purport to want to address. It's impossible in this country to not talk about racialized capitalism when you talk about philanthropy, because the fact is that this wealth was accumulated from the extraction of resources through native genocide, chattel slavery, sexism, exclusion, what one writer I appreciate calls anti-Black racism, capitalism, and sort of oppression of Black and brown communities. And so I don't know that philanthropy can be done differently. This is a grand experiment with that history. Can we move through the world in a different way? But I'm trying. And this is an experiment. I joined Weisberg Foundation in November of 2021, and we are doing everything possible to demonstrate that there is a different way to do philanthropy. So I'll just share those things.
Thank you so much for that, Rashawn. And I think that everything you said is absolutely right about kind of the history of philanthropy. When we implemented our courageous fundraising principles, which I know some of you have seen and have been a part of, but feel free to go to our website and read up on those principles that we created, we did a lot of research into like the history of philanthropy and how it was started and how it really was, you know, building on the backs of those who, you know, problems that were created by the people who then created institutions to solve those problems, but not in the ways that they needed to be solved. Right? So we say, oh, these poor people that need our help, let's start a foundation that ends up, you know, being a tax shelter, and it doesn't actually address the needs. Like, you know, if you have people that are starving in your community, make sure they have the wages to feed themselves. Don't start necessarily, you know, the answer is not necessarily a food bank. It is like making sure people have what they need to take care of themselves. And so, so thank you for that. So a couple of the questions we have, and like I said, only a few questions and want this to be conversational, is to kind of help us understand your journey to this space. So I heard you say you're a reluctant philanthropist and an accidental philanthropist, but then once you got into this space, help me understand who influenced this journey. Did you always think about it this way, or was this something that came about as you started to get into this this space and into philanthropy? Yeah, just help us understand that journey for you.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I did about 2 years in corporate philanthropy before I realized that wasn't quite for me. And I did 6 years prior to coming to the Weisberg Foundation, was at another foundation, sort of writing the grants, doing the work of program officers, not reading the reports that you all send because there's never time. And I think I began to think about what would it look like if we funded organizations like we wanted them to win? What would it look like if instead of centering the foundation's need to meet a 5% payout minimum, it's not a ceiling, it's a floor, what would it look like if we just turned that on its head? What would it look like if we didn't support sort of the nonprofit development complex, right? The fact that so much of you all's time is spent writing huge grant applications for $5,000 of funding, right? There's a fundamental imbalance with the work that we require for the funds that we're willing to commit. At the same time, I'm learning from people like Edgar Villanueva, who talks about money as medicine and philanthropy as repair. What would it look like if we were thinking about philanthropy as reparations versus philanthropy as charity, which is really, I think, the dominant mode. And I think as a Black woman in this space, looking at the history of philanthropy, and the fact that there are definitely changes over time, but the fact that the racial wealth gap continues to grow, even though philanthropy has been throwing money at it, that economically African Americans are in virtually the same place that we were 50 years ago. I just begin to ask, all of this money is being spent. What do we have to show for it? And to your point, not another food bank, or we read 10,000 books to the kids, but are we really trying to shift power, or is philanthropy more committed to the status quo? And unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that philanthropy is much more wedded to status quo than they are to really shifting systems. Because for that to happen, we have to shift power. Who has it, who wields it, who has control over funds. And I think there are a growing number of both people of color and white allies who are sitting in this seat and saying things need to be done differently. And we're less concerned about our long-term future in philanthropy than we are about shifting money and resources to support organizations. So it's been an evolution. There's great work out there, but we're fighting upstream, I would say.
So I think it would be helpful for people to know a little bit about, and this was something that I had thought about before, but like, so what I call this kind of style that you and Weisberg kind of have embodied is trust-based philanthropy, really trusting the work, trusting the people, trusting, right? And what I see more times in mainstream philanthropy is like it's so much, like, to your point about why do we have such long applications for $5,000? It's because people don't trust that the work that we're doing is what we say that we're going to do, and that trust is even further diminished when you add an organization led by a person of color, particularly Black people, and particularly women of color, and Black women, right? So it's because there's no trust there. We don't actually inherently trust, or in this case, philanthropy doesn't inherently trust that we are doing what we say we're going to do, that we are, right? And really, to your point earlier about kind of your introduction to understanding philanthropy being mutual aid for community and doing the things in the community, we have been holding our communities on our back for generations, right? We have been taking care of the things in our communities when someone needs something, showing up, whether from a faith perspective and churches showing up to invest in the community, or just from a like, hey, my neighbor needs something, I'm gonna go show up for them. Somebody needs somewhere to sleep for a little while. I grew up in a house very similar, like people, we had a room in our house just for people who needed a place to stay. My dad was a youth pastor, and so he would just have people staying in our house all the time. Sometimes my mom would come home and say, who's this new person that's here with us for who knows how long? And it would just be that way. So like, there's not any legitimacy to that distrust. It just is there, right? So talk to me a little bit more about kind of that philosophy, that trust-based philanthropy kind of philosophy that that you're talking about. What does that practically look like in the way that you all do grant making?
Yeah, I think before we get to the practicality, we have to like uncover sort of this history. I would say it goes far beyond trust to the fact that philanthropy has been paternalistic in our approach with our grantee partners. And that goes back, I remember reading something about Andrew Carnegie, who started the Carnegie Foundations, and he made his wealth in, I think, railroads and steel. And it's reported, and he built wonderful public libraries. We have him to thank for those institutions. And I love those libraries. He was asked once, because his workers were striking for higher wages, instead of doing this philanthropy, why not increase the wages of your workers? And he said, because they would just drink it and smoke it away. They wouldn't make good choices. And so I choose to do this. And I think that ethos is still the dominant thread in philanthropy today, that communities can't be trusted to do what communities need. And they need a paternalistic overseer to help them navigate. It reminds me too of one of my philanthropy colleagues said something once that I thought was so powerful. He said, communities have been solving their problems since before government and philanthropy, for millennia, right? And so there is this long history of the ability to do that. Andre Perry from the Brookings Institution often says, there's nothing wrong with Black people that won't be fixed by solving racism, right? And so these ideas that communities are fundamentally asset-based, that they have solutions, that they don't need someone to tell them what the solution is at odds with the very nature of philanthropy. It also comes up when you hear funders talk about, the reasons why they give 5%. Most talk about needing to be there in perpetuity, needing to be there when the next COVID comes, needing to be there when whatever the next crisis is. And part of that is saying, we don't believe that people now have the solutions to these problems. So we'll need to be around then to help people, right? So this charity mindset, I find, unless philanthropy starts to grapple with its origin story, until it investigates how its funds were created, we will remain this paternalistic, we have the power, we make the decisions, it's our money. And you should frankly be grateful grantees who give us appreciation and not critique. I think once you start to uncover how philanthropic wealth was accumulated, you can't help but decide, my goal is to shift these resources back to community. And the way to do that is in partnership. So trust-based philanthropy, a lot of folks are signing on to it and saying we shorten our grant applications, we're giving multi-year general operating support. But the practice or the philosophy hasn't actually shifted. It is still very paternalistic. It is still very much, our mission is to build power of leaders and organizations who are most impacted by racism in order to shift systems. That mission is a generational mission. It's not on a 2-year or a 3-year grant cycle. So until we start providing grantee partners with funding for the long term, what are you going to shift in structural racism in 2 years? What is the outcome or measurement you would give to a funder to say, we're eliminating racism, you need to fund us? It's frustrating. So I'll get off my soapbox about that. In terms of practicality, even before I arrived at the foundation in November of 2021, as early as I want to say 2006, 2007, the foundation was doing things like multi-year general operating support. Today, I think 77% of our funding is multi-year support. 50% is multi-year general operating support. 50% of our grantees are Black-led and accountable. 25% are BIPOC-led and accountable, and 25% are white-led and accountable. And so the Weisberg Foundation has had a long history of doing this work that predates me. And my predecessor, Han Lee, shifted to grantee conversations instead of grantee reports a few years ago, really with the idea to put the onus on us. So it is our responsibility as the foundation to talk with our grantee partners, to listen, and to synthesize that so that we have a record for the foundation. It's not your responsibility to take a 10-page form and craft language so that it fits what our needs are. So that's one of the things that we've done. Another thing that we're doing is when grantees let us know what they need. And so recently a grantee had asked for help on their RFP for a strategic planning consultant. And we helped out with that. So providing that technical assistance is also important. And then they came back and said, we think this is going to cost about $20,000. Are there any funds at the foundation to help? Or they didn't tell us how much it was. And I wrote back and said, well, how much do you need? And they said $20,000. And so then I wrote back and said, here's your approval for $20,000 for the strategic plan. And they wrote back and they said, I don't understand what just happened. Like, I thought you were going to say you could apply for $2,000. If it costs $20,000 to do the strategic plan, what good is it for me to give you $2,000 and then you have to go find the other 18? I mean, And so we're trying to reduce the barriers, because that's work we can do, right? That's work that internally we don't have to have systems and applications, and what is the purpose of the strategic planning, and what consultant are you choosing, and should we have the ability to help select them? These are all ways that we say give the folks on the ground the money and let them do the work and get out of the way. I don't know what else we're doing, Leah. Maybe you could say.
Again, you saw in the comments how people reacted just to that story, which has been our experience with Weisberg, where, you know, there was a situation where we're trying to buy a building right now on the south side and start a healing hub for the community and all of these things that many of you know, and some of you maybe don't, and would love to share some of those ideas. And this has come from the community. The community has said we need these spaces. The community has said we need to heal. The community has said all of these things. And so we're saying, okay, let's figure out how to get there. But one of the big things that we've struggled with is, you know, once you acquire a building, and as a nonprofit, there's all kinds of funding to like help you, if you're, refurbish that building, if it's an old building, or like do all these things, there's lots of funding. But until you have ownership of it, that it doesn't really exist. And so we were struggling with like, okay, well, how are we gonna, like, the down payment side of this, right? You have to have money to even get the building in that process. And so I was having this conversation, more of a like general conversation with Rashawn about all the things that we're doing. And she heard that and said, okay, great. And we got a check in the mail to help with our down payment assistance, right? And it was just one of those things. We didn't write a grant for it. We didn't spend a ton of time going back and forth about like, how are you going to, report on this, and how are you going to be accountable to it? And it takes time to acquire buildings. It takes time to do, and there's been no pressure to say like, well, did you do it yet? Did you do it yet? Did you get it? Did you do it? Right? Like, and that in itself is a huge thing. So like, it's mind blowing, but like, what I hear you saying in some ways, Rashawn, is that's the bare minimum that we should be doing, right? Like that's the bare minimum that should be done from the philanthropic space, is like just trusting people and saying, here's what you need. Tell me what you dream. What do you, when you dream about what it could be, like that sounds like that's again the floor, not the ceiling. So what's the dream? Yeah.
So one of the things that we just had a board meeting in March, and one of the things that I'm starting to talk to our board about is what would it mean to fund partners like we want them to win? What would it mean to allow them to future plan, to invest in their people, to have the freedom that we do as a foundation with an endowment, knowing the money's there. Mm-hmm. And so what would a $1 million transformational grant look like for an organization? How could we help our partners build their own emergency reserves or endowment for, again, this is generational work? And so I think it's not, I don't think it's long-term. I'm looking to do this really rather soon, but investing in organizations' future work, right? We have so much that is critical and needs to be done right now in Virginia across the Commonwealth. And, $50,000 multi-year grants of time is not going to get us there, right? So the challenges that you all are grappling with we need to pay our staff, right? We need to, because we've been conditioned to put all the money in programs and not support staff and have benefits that attract people and have enough people so people are not burning out, you're running so leanly. How do we shift that? So we're thinking about that. We're thinking about the genesis of the foundation's wealth is commercial real estate. So we're learning a lot about the history of land in this country, the prehistory, the indigenous, our indigenous siblings who have lost land. We're learning about the really unprecedented loss of Black farmland in the US over the last 100 years. And we're starting to think about land justice. So what would it mean for us to make transformational grants to reclaim land? What would it mean for us to think about wealth building in a really different way? You know, ideally, we're going to get to a call for federal reparations. Is work that I think I'm really excited about the potential for us to do. So we're just trying to break down barriers. We're just trying to say, what would it mean if we funded folks like we want them to win?
Yeah.
It means bringing some grantees into decision making at the board level. So this is still in process, but you know, our board thinks it's important, as I do, to have a grantee perspective on the board. And so how do we continue to shift power so that the people making the decisions are like the people on the ground? So that's what's next for us.
Yeah. So I think the last question I'll ask before we kind of open it up for anyone to ask any questions is like, then now, so we've talked about kind of the perspective of Weisberg and how you've gotten there and what y'all are doing and what does trust-based philanthropy look like and all of those things. How do we get more funders to think this way? How do we get more funders into this space? I think sometimes Becca offered a really kind of awesome perspective on this when we were talking about this conversation about like how, you know, a lot of times, you know, in the same way that racism is often ends up being solved by people of color and Black people in particular, but that shouldn't be our job because we didn't create the system. In lots of ways, philanthropy is similar to that, right? Where, you know, the nonprofits are kind of there, it feels like the onus is on us, even though we know the onus is on philanthropy, but like to your point about the charity perspective, that perspective is really hard to break down when that has been the prevailing and historically the way that people think about it. And so now it feels like the onus is on us as nonprofits to help change this system, and that really shouldn't be. But I do think that maybe there's a role for us to play in this process. And so it's kind of two questions. How do we get those other funders that are in spaces like this to start think like this? I think there are some that are moving in that direction. And then like, what can nonprofits do to be a part of that movement, right? You mentioned the 5% as the floor. How do we get them to thinking about let's activate some more of our funding, and because we have divested, especially in BIPOC organizations, let's keep that 5% going to where it goes, but let's activate 3, 4, 5, another 5%, and let's just specifically invest that in Black and Brown organizations. What something like that look like? How do we get others to think about these kinds of perspectives, first from the trust base, and then activating even more to invest even more?
Yeah. So I want to talk about power again. I want to make sure I talk about, I want to make sure I talk about the role of philanthropy, and then I want to make sure I talk about endowments and investments. So power. This is a bold move for Virginia Community Voice to have this discussion. And I think I would be remiss if I did not say it is really hard for our nonprofit partners to push this work because you face potential backlash from funders. And so I wish this were not the case, but I would say it's being careful. It's choosing strategically when to act and how to act. And some people have said, you know, we don't care. We're going to just go out and do it. I think there was a point you brought up when we were emailing about this, and I said, this sounds like an op-ed we need to co-pen, right? Yeah. So there are things like that can be done from a grantee funder perspective, where the funder can give its nonprofit partner cover
Mhm.
and the funder delivers the difficult message.
Mhm.
And it doesn't have backlash for our nonprofit partners. So that's one of the big things we have to keep out in front is the power dynamic and the imbalance now.
Mhm.
Because of that, I think most of this work has to be done funder to funder.
Mm.
So right now, I flew down this morning to Raleigh, North Carolina, where the Association of Black Foundation Executives is having its annual conversation. And there are panels about endowing organizations. There are panels about what does it mean to really live into trust-based philanthropy. And as we go to different conferences, talking to each other and letting foundations know what we're doing, how it's meeting legal standards and accounting standards is really critical to this work. The thing I wanted to mention about endowments, and I'm still, I almost said when you said, what is the dream? You know, for me, probably 5 years, the dream was that every foundation spend down and give all the money away. What I have learned, and one of the things I'm most proud of at the foundation is we have committed to 100% of our assets, endowment, grant portfolio, being activated for racial equity and justice. What that means is there are things that on the grant making side, I can't fund, right? Because it wouldn't be a grant to a nonprofit organization. But on the investment side of the house, right, I can invest in a pool to provide BIPOC families with down payments for their first homes in order to build generational wealth. So I am looking at all the tools at our disposal and figuring out, okay, this I can do with grants. This I can do with an investment. This I can do by, supporting a Black business incubator in Richmond, for example. And so I'm of the mind of, don't just use 5%. You have to use 100% to get to your goal. And if folks are using 100% to get to their goal, I think there's room, right? There's room.
Yeah, that is a ambitious and beautiful and hard and scary and all of the things that come with it. Those are, but it's the dream, right? It's like, how do we get there? How do we actually, and still living in scarcity mode. I'm like, can we get another little 5? Can we get another, can we get 5%? Can we get, right? Instead of saying no, like, how do we activate all of this? How do we activate all of this funding with the history in mind that this was all built on the backs of the people that the ancestors that came before us, both in our in the Black and Brown community and with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, with right, like all of those spaces. And so, yeah, I thank you so much. Any questions? I'll shift now. We only have about 12 minutes left, so I'd love to be able to hear from y'all what you think about this process. Mr. Jerome, go for it.
Thank you, Leah. Thanks for inviting me. I was surprised that I got an invitation. I don't know why. We haven't seen each other for quite some time. Yeah, but this is amazing because as a president of a nonprofit organization, there's a couple of things here. There are a couple of foundations that have supported the process of where we're going to try to also to purchase a building. But they said, here's some of the caveats that you have to have. We'll give you so much up front, and then once you have the building, we'll give you the rest. But then I think also too, what I'm finding a difficulties with as far as moving this process along is that so many of the websites that we go to, they make it impossible to actually ask them for support. And so how do we get over that hurdle when they say, we're not going to support, in order for you to even talk to us, you have to go through these kinds of processes. And so that has been a major hurdle for, I know for me, having actually operating several nonprofit organizations on different ilks. So how do we get through that process? To be honest with you, I'm looking at the Weisberg Foundation. If I was not on this conversation and I just happened upon it, I would just write it off because I don't see how this foundation supports what I'm trying to do.
Perfect.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think, Mr. Jerome, if there was a question, if there's a question for me, one of the things that I think I'd respond to is foundations are really struggling on what their process will be for making grants, getting to know new grant organizations. Part of trust-based philanthropy is the onus being on the foundation to go out and find the organizations, because what we know is that when foundations wait for inbound inquiries, they tend to look a lot like past grantees. So that's why only a small portion of funding is going to Black and Brown led organizations, because funders have historically looked in their networks, and to the degree funders were white, their networks and their grantees were white. And so now funders are trying to decide, okay, should we allow inbound requests, knowing that most of the requests we might get might be from people who are in our circles, or are we going to go out and find who we're looking for? Some people are going to invitation only RFP processes. And a lot of that is because, you know, every foundation is different, but they do have fixed amounts of money. And the last thing many foundations want to do is have hundreds of people apply for what they know will only be 5 grants. And so it's a real question on finding the organizations, the funders that align with you. I think that's a responsibility of the funding community. So one of the things I regularly do, if there's something we funded and people say, hey, we're doing this application for so-and-so, do you know anybody there? Do you know anybody who would fund? And I send a message to my group to say, hey, I know you're interested in this. We just supported them. I'd like for you to take a look at it. And so that should become an expectation that funders will do that. I see other hands up, so I'll stop there.
I think Yasmin first and then Bishop Moore.
Hello, Ms. Rashawn. I don't even know where to begin, because everything you have said today has just been incredible and mind-blowing. And it shouldn't have to be mind-blowing, because to me, it's just common human decency, a lot of it. But one of my questions is, what is your foundation's process for determining your capacity for how much funding you want to give away annually? I just think I'm so like nonprofit focused. It's just like, we have our budget meetings and we have to figure out a pipeline for how we're going to raise X amount of money for the next fiscal year if we're trying to grow staff and we're trying to increase programs. But on your side, how do you, like, if you do get like, you know, one of those requests from Leah about like, hey, like our building fund, like we need money, and then you're able to like give that funding, like, how does it look for your foundation to know how much you can give away when you do have these kind of pop-up requests that you do want to support?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great question. And I will just stress that every foundation will probably have a different process. But for private foundations, we are mandated to distribute at least 5% of our total assets in grant making, or in support of grant making. And so that gives us that floor, right? And so what we're able to do is then modeling with our investment advisors who are investing our assets for racial equity and justice, to say, okay, if we spend this much, what does that do to our assets if we do this? What I think we are pushing to do is say, what is the impact if we don't spend, right? Because so often we're looking at the impact on the financial side, but we need to look at the impact on what won't happen in Virginia if we don't spend. And we're trying to weigh those things together. And it's it's complex and it's I won't say it's complex. It's actually fairly simple, actually. But it is having the will to ask those questions. In terms of, again, every foundation is different, but we have at our discretion opportunity funds. We have our multi-year grant commitments, and we know what they're going to be, and we can plug those into the budget. But then there's also opportunity funds. So things that come across the desk that we can respond to pretty quickly. Other foundations may not have that, that decision-making authority really set up with staff. Sometimes that resides with the board. But one of the things we're also thinking about is how do we respond on grantee cycles and not on foundation cycles? Our board gets together 4 times a year. And so if we have to wait to do anything until we're at those meetings, is that really in the best service of our grantee partners, right? So we're playing with what we can do between those meetings as well. So appreciate that question.
That was a great question, Yasmin. Thank you, Mr. Jerome and Yasmin, for those great questions. Bishop Moore, did you still have a question?
Yes, I do. And
Okay.
I am talking through E because I don't have any sound on the one you're looking at, but I'm just floored. I thank you, Lee Whitehurst, for Gibson for inviting me. I'm floored, and my question is based around, I am a faith leader, and so I lead a religious organization that's geared towards racial equality and justice. And the only source that we've been able to find is the Lilly Foundation endowments, and we're usually overthrown because we don't have a connection with the university, or we don't have enough. We're newly organized. So I want to know, is your foundation religious organization friendly? And when I mean that, I'm not talking about 501c3, because that's usually the disqualifier for most of us. But us in the trenches, are you all even entertaining conversations with religious organizations such as myself?
Thank you, Reverend Moore, for that question. I will say the history of the foundation has not been that there's been necessarily supporting religious organizations. Our main focus right now is power building in local communities, and we realize that power building is happening in a variety of areas. And so churches, particularly Black churches, have long been the centers of power building in Black communities. And so I think we are thinking about, what does that support look like and who are the partners that we would work with? We fund across Virginia. And so one of the things we're thinking about is, the state level organizations that we're working with. And then geographically, we tend to have good, deep partnerships in the Golden Crescent, right? Northern Virginia, Richmond, Hampton Roads. But there's so much else in Virginia. So how do we get connected in those areas? And religious institutions might be a pathway for that. So I can't say what will happen in the future, but stay tuned for more.
Thank you. And I am probably one of the disqualified because we are Pentecostal. So we usually never get to the table to have the conversation with that. So that's another conversation, but thank you for that insight. I'm on the lookout.
I have Pentecostal roots as well, so we're all in this space together. But yeah, so I thank everyone for being a part of this conversation. So grateful, Rashawn, to you for being here and for being so honest and open and frank about where we are and where we need to go. And I just want to say As we close, as we transition, please reach out to us. Let us know if there are other things in this vein that you all want to talk about and want to engage with and have more people come and have conversations with, because we really want this to be useful. We want this to be a space that feels like we can commiserate together, like minds, but also we want it to feel useful. And so, yeah, please, hopefully those of you that didn't know about Weisberg now know about Weisberg and can engage in conversations there. And then also know that we have training and coaching that we do when we think about these kinds of things. Like part of this conversation, to Rashawn's point about power building, is we have to begin to organize together as nonprofits, as organizations, organize around the things that we really believe need to happen, right? That's my background. I'm an organizer, and in part because I grew up in Black church, right? And so I know that organizing is fundamental to the way that we move through the world and the way that we can get anything done, because our single voices don't work often. We very rarely are able to get things done with one voice. But when we come together as many voices, we have the power to push things forward. And so hopefully we can continue this conversation from that vein of thinking about how we can organize together to push some of these initiatives forward, to get more investment in the power building structures that already exist in our communities, to get more investment in Black and Brown organizations that and Native organizations that have been divested, right? So all of these things are hopefully where we can go with conversations like this to move things forward. And know that we have training and coaching. As an organization, we do training and coaching for other organizations. So please, if you would like to reach out on that front, please do. So thank y'all so much. Have a wonderful day. Yep, that's a beautiful picture of Flo. Feel free to reach out to her around training and coaching work. And thank y'all so much. And we'll be in touch about anything else that you would like to kind of talk about. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank y'all.